All right, talking about the history of the Wilma Theater, the long, colorful, sometimes sordid history of the Wilma Theater. Who knows anything about the Wilma Theater? Nothing at all? You must know where it is, right? That crazy kind of trapezoidal shaped building sitting right down on the corner there? Sure. Built in 1921 by this fella, William A. Simmons, in honor of that woman, Edna Wilma, who later became Edna Wilma Simmons. They met in 1909. She and her sister were a very popular vaudeville duo, the Wilma sisters. They used to sing and dance and do other types of performance in light opera, little classic productions like The Chocolate Soldier, that you've probably heard of a bunch. Not really. She didn't really ever make it big in vaudeville, but she was a fantastic businessman, as we will find out, or businesswoman. The story of the Wilma Theater begins with this love story, but it begins a little bit further back with this fella, Billy Simmons, who built it for his wife. He was born in Kansas in 1864. When he was 14 years old, his father died in a logging accident. He was guiding a big boom of logs down a river in Kansas when he slipped in and drowned, leaving Billy Simmons at age 14, the head of the household that included 6 kids and his widowed mother. He started working to make ends meet, or to help the family make ends meet, at a shop that built kinds of cabinetry, cupboards, woodworking things, coffins. And he worked there for for somewhat less than a year. Didn't get the raise he wanted, so he gave his notice and marched across the street to work for a different guy who also did cabinetry and cupboards and made coffins. But evidently, I think that this guy was a much better boss. He's the kind of boss who we all sort of want to have, because he would go home for a long lunch. He was German. He would go home for a big long lunch with his family, have a couple of beers, greasy, big meal, and come back to his shop and spend the rest of the afternoon sleeping in one of the coffins. So he left 15-year-old Billy to do most of the work of running the business, and Billy proved to be pretty good at running businesses. He saved up some money, and with some more, I think $1,000 that he got basically credit for his father's gold watch, he went into business selling coffee and pancakes to railroad men in Cherryvale, Kansas, where he was growing up. And he was fantastically successful at that too. After a couple years, he was able to sell his share in that business for many, many times what he'd put into it. He took those proceeds and rented the second floor of, I think, a disused apartment building in Kansas, bought a bunch of pairs of roller skates, and opened a roller skating rink. This is in 1881. An 1881 roller skating rink. I think that is just fantastic. I can't imagine the music was the same though. I always think about Funky Town and like the theme from Dukes of Hazzard when I'm roller skating, that kind of stuff. I don't know what they would have done. Probably had a live orchestra, or like chamber music or something like that. In any case, when the thrill of roller skating wore off, which I know is a little bit hard to believe, he came up to Montana from Kansas. He followed a friend of his who had already set himself up here and said, "Hey, it's great, man. Come check it out." So he came up here, and almost immediately he started cooking this scheme to put together the biggest Wild West show that he could conceive of. Remember what Wild West shows are? Buffalo Bill, Calamity Jane, bison, tricks, shooting tricks, ponies. He wanted to have the Wild West show to end all Wild West shows. He wanted a show so big that no tent could possibly contain it. The show that he had in mind had hundreds of costumed participants. Cowboys, Indians, a herd of bison, who were extremely difficult to get off and on the trains, by the way. Cows apparently are more inclined to load themselves into cattle cars than bison. Go figure. And another attraction of this show was said to be a mountain lion that was trained to ride a pony. I would pay top dollar to see that today. In fact, if that was going on right now, so long, suckers! I'm gonna go watch a mountain lion riding a pony. Well, it didn't quite work out for him in his big Wild West show. He was taking the show on the road east through the Midwest, and the first stop was in Butte, where on the night of July 5th, 1887, I believe, it snowed 5 inches. Kind of put that big outdoor show out of business. And I guess the production was similarly dogged by bad weather, tornadoes, locusts, rivers running blood, frogs falling from the sky, all of these perils as it made its way westward to the point where he just decided that enough was enough with the Wild West show. But in the meantime, he'd also started diversifying his holdings in a much more sensible way. He owned a lot of buildings. He was starting to buy theaters. He was starting to take an interest in touring groups, vaudeville groups and things like that. So he was actually like a pretty well-rounded, integrated businessman. Had a lot of holdings in Portland, Oregon, had a lot of property in Wallace, Idaho, and had a lot of property in Missoula, Montana. Didn't have himself a young lady to share it all with. So according to the story, in 1909 or so, he accosted one of the Wilma sisters after a performance in front of the theater. Liked that show so much, coincidentally ran into her on the sidewalk the next day, and within a year they were married. And they got married in Portland. They lived the first 12 years of their life in Wallace, Idaho. All of her life, she would remember arriving in Wallace, Idaho in December 1909. And how much snow there was, and how back then everybody turned out to see a train, you know? Everybody came out to see what was going to get off the train, what was going to get unloaded, who's getting a grand piano, who's arriving in town. She never forgot that memory. Moved to Missoula in 1920 and immediately set about the business of building her namesake theater. Kind of a difficult engineering feat because it was right on the edge of a river at the time. If you want to step forward, you can see that until the early 1960s, the Wilma came right up to the edge of the water. The north channel of the river flowed right up to the bottom of the Wilma Theater. You can still see like the railing, like right below where that balcony is now, was the river, which made it really easy for people to clean up between shows. Those ushers, you know, Missoula's, for the longest time, has treated this river really horribly. They used to be able to dump your garbage into the river off of the Orange Street Bridge, effectively. And up until 1960, like, yeah, you're an usher at the Wilma, right into the river. Terrible. Another thing, this island, by the way, has a bizarre history all of its own. There have been all kinds of things there, which doesn't make any sense at all to build anything there, because, you know, it floods basically every year. There's an amusement park built on this. For like a year. If you see some photos, like you see some photos taken from space, you can still see like old concrete fixtures of like wading pools and like the foundations of some of these attractions. Right in the middle of a floodplain. It's not like this thing floods once every 100 years, you know? I guess that like city planning and like, you know, the kind of homework that you're supposed to do before you just go build an amusement park, it's rather evolved since like the 1940s. In any case, boys back in the day used to wade across the southern channel of the river. This would be down by the Milwaukee station. Used to wade across that southern channel, walk across the island, and bounce their lures off of the wall of the Wilma. They would try to get into this little fishing hole that was in that north channel. Poking out of the same wall that they bounced their lures off was a couple of pipes dumping raw sewage into their swimming hole. So it took them a while until they worked up the enthusiasm to try one of these fish that they were catching. It's pretty much strictly catch and release back then. They did try one and they said it tasted turpentine, and they never tried it again. Anyway, where was I? My gosh, there's so much stuff to go over. When the Wilma Theater, it's actually called the Smead-Simmons building. Simmons' partner, his financial partner in building this building that the Wilma is part of, was a guy named Smead, a former Indian agent, pretty crooked is my understanding. But when they started building the Smead-Simmons building, it was going to be, briefly anyway, the tallest building in Montana. It was called Montana's first skyscraper. And the big news that when it opened was not the theater itself, but the swimming pool in its basement. Y'all know that there's a swimming pool in the basement of the Wilma, right? You can still access it, kind of, you know, if you get the right connections. Just kidding. I don't even have those connections. It's office buildings now, but there used to be a trap door that you could go in. And this is, if you've seen a movie at the Wilma, like prior to 5 years ago, say, maybe you saw it at the street level, like where the parking lot is. That's the old Wilma 3 and 4. It used to be, it's basically like the floor right above the swimming pool. Like right below that floor. Like you can open this trap door and essentially walk down into the shallow end of the swimming pool. It's still there. That was a huge draw when the place opened up in the 1920s. Missoula already had plenty of movie theaters in 1920, 1921, so it wasn't like opening a movie theater was a big deal. Right across the street, where they've recently built the new bank, on the site of the ugly old bank that was built on the site of the bank before that, there used to be a little row of theaters there, including the Rialto Theater. And the Rialto was interesting because it had a blind pianist who used to play along with silent movies. No easy feat to be a blind pianist playing along with silent movies. He had a little kid sitting next to him who would whisper cues into his ear. His name was Melvin Book or Bauk, I don't know how you say it. But he had this little kid who would say like, it's kind of a sappy part, and he would play like the sort of sappy romantic music. You know, it's a stagecoach chase, and he would like, you know, bust into like, he had like this little interpreter, this blind pianist. Fantastic. So obviously in 1921, Missoula was not lacking for movie culture, but the swimming pool was a huge deal because there wasn't really any public swimming except for lakes and rivers in 1921, and one singularly filthy public pool. There's a parking garage there now. It's down by the Holiday Inn. They just built this new parking garage by the trailhead. And you remember before that it was kind of like scooped out a little bit below street level. That's the site of the swimming pool. It was basically a wide open concrete basin, never covered, collected leaves, dust, you know, moss, lily pads, frogs, I don't even know, but it was supposed to be very filthy swimming. And this is a time when people were still really freaked out about waterborne polio. It had only been a few years before that polio outbreaks in New York and Philadelphia had killed or crippled hundreds and hundreds of people, mostly kids. So in 1921, safe indoor supervised public swimming with French fries was a pretty big deal. That was the big draw. The crystal turbine filtration system. All of these bells and whistles about the new swimming pool. Another big thing about the Wilma opening that was related to the movies was the fact that it was fireproof. It was billed to be like a fireproof theater. Does anyone know why fireproof theaters were especially important in the 1920s?
Smoking? Did everyone smoke?
Yeah, you can definitely smoke in theaters, but the film itself would sometimes spontaneously combust or start on fire. In the old days, like the classic silent movies were made on silver nitrate film, which looks beautiful because it was loaded up with actual silver, but highly, highly dangerous because the actual plastic base that it's on is chemically related to TNT. Very dangerous. Loves to start on fire. Nitrate film loves to burn. Starts burning, burns underwater. You just cannot put this stuff out. And it's a tragedy. I mean, a joke about this is apparently in Victoria or Vancouver, Canada, in the 1920s, a theater burned to the ground because a nitrate print started on fire of a movie they were showing called Safety First. I don't know if it's true, but even in the 20s, there were big, big tragedies involving this film. The Dromcollar incident in Ireland, an entire movie house packed with barefoot Irish kids up in flames because this film started on fire. It still happens. I mean, in the 70s and 80s, it occasionally happens that this film will spontaneously combust. Even under ideal storage conditions, it will start on fire and take out like an entire national film archive with it. It's happened in France, it's happened in Canada, it's happened in Mexico, where, you know, spontaneously combusting silent film basically wipes out a huge part of that country's filmic record of itself. Extraordinary. The original negatives of Citizen Kane, destroyed on a nitrate fire. All these really important artifacts, a lot of them destroyed by silent film. My gosh, that was a tangent within a tangent within a tangent. A fireproof theater, pretty big deal in the 1920s. The first movie, this is like the $1 million question, the first movie to show at the Wilma Theater. The Mask of Zorro, Douglas Fairbanks. Cost more to make that movie than it cost to build the Wilma Theater. Isn't that great? Silent movies didn't come to the Wilma until 1929, 1930. They weren't actually the first not actually the first theater in Missoula to show a sound movie. That was the Rialto Theater. Poor Melvin Book, out of a job, you know. It was really expensive. You know, it was really expensive to suddenly go from showing silent movies to being able to show sound movies. Lots of interesting things happened that first week. Not too long after the Wilma was opened, a Hollywood talent scout came to town and encouraged young Missoulians to show up for screen tests at the Wilma. You know, he shot some outdoor scenes, and he also tried out, you know, he did little screen tests for ambitious young starlets and would-be movie stars. I've often wondered what happened to that film, like if it survives anywhere. This glimpse of Montana in the movies in the 1920s. But I don't think so, because they usually destroyed that film. Like, the reason that so much of that film doesn't, apart from the fact that it occasionally starts on fire, is that old films were just destroyed. The big reels were chopped in half with an axe if they couldn't be pirated. They were sent off to factories that turned them into things like black powder that reclaimed things from them. In fact, there was the joke that you could be, not a joke, but you could be watching like a flock of ducks on the screen one year, and the next year it would be like actually the black powder in your shotgun that you would take out shooting ducks. Not a whole lot of consideration given to what was going to happen to the film, and that's probably what happened to all those screen tests. Okay, I got some characters to get back to here. Where on earth was I anyway? The Simmons, right. When Billy Simmons died in 1937, that's the guy who built the theater for Edna Simmons, he left his theatrical empire to his wife, who became the female head of one of the most successful theatrical holdings. She was like one of the biggest women in entertainment in terms of owning theaters in the United States, certainly in the Northwest. Did I talk about the Fox Corporation? So you gotta forgive me if I forget what I said. I'm kind of on this big long loop all day and it doesn't complete all the way. The Wilma Theater was partly destroyed from the inside out in the 1940s. Does anybody know why? Because the Wilma Theater used to be held hostage to the Fox Corporation. We know about the Fox Corporation because of 20th Century Fox, right? Well, Fox used to be one of the so-called Big Five Hollywood corporations that owned basically everything. And they had coercive business practices, and they could totally coerce, not legally, but de facto they owned the Wilma Theater. They had control of the Wilma Theater. If the Wilma Theater didn't want to show Fox movies, they weren't going to get nothing to show. This practice was called block booking, where these entertainment corporations could force theaters into showing the movies that they wanted them to see. It was declared unconstitutional in the 40s, and a decision was handed down called the Paramount Consent that forcibly divested Fox from the Wilma. Like, it basically said, okay, Fox, you got to get out of the Wilma Theater. They did not go quietly. They destroyed the inside of the theater. Actually, the corporation had always done terrible things to the Wilma. In the late 1990s, a considerable amount of money and time was spent in restoring some of the very ornate plasterwork in the lobbies. Anyone notice this? Once upon a time, that was all slathered over with a sickly orange paint. Because in the 1930s, the Fox Corporation decided that they need, with the Great Depression starting to sink in, they wanted to project this image of austerity. Like, people don't want pretty stuff. People don't want ornate plasterwork. People want a baby crap green or they wanted to project austerity, so they came in and just painted over everything. In the late 1940s, under the pretense of evacuating their stuff from the Wilma Theater, I just forgot my lunchbox, I'm gonna go back to the Wilma Theater. They carted out everything they could. They destroyed everything they could. They threw tons of rope, rigging, theatrical stuff, projection equipment into the river, which, of course, was conveniently located right outside of the exit. I don't know what legal recourse Edna Wilma, who did own the theater back then, I don't know what recourse she took against the Fox Corporation. But I do know that she basically set about building it again from the inside out with her own money. She installed new seats, she installed new decorations, she installed a perfumed fountain in the lobby, which she encouraged women to dip their hankies in before finding their seats. And she eventually married a man who was 25 years younger than her and openly homosexual in the 1940s. Both pretty uncommon things to do. She always said, and that is this guy, Ed Sharp. Ed Sharp, right? It's a bird he's holding there, and more about that bird in just a minute. She married this guy who was, like her, very theatrical, an excellent musician, didn't quite make it in show business, but she always said to the end of her life that she just had way more in common with this guy. I think this is what's called a lavender arrangement, or a marriage of convenience. I think lavender is the word, where it was just a wonderful sort of partnership for both of them, romantic in a way, but just because they were really good friends and they liked a lot of the same things. You'll see that she's buried off to one side. The top stone there is consecrated to the memory of a pigeon, which I'll talk about in a minute. And below that, Edward Sharp. And below him, I should say, is one of the last partners in the Wilma, Bob Sias. I don't exactly know why the graves are arranged thusly, but there's obviously a story there. Ed Sharp, a dyed-in-the-wool Missoula character. Does anyone have an Ed Sharp story? Yeah?
When I was little, I'd go down and he had the feeder of the dove.
Yep.
Yeah.
Chapel of the Dove. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, he'd sell his popcorn, but his bird would be on his head.
Yes, right. That bird used to take an active hand. Have I talked about the bird and money? This bird took an active hand in like the running of the business, which also included at certain times the Roxy Theater and the Go West Drive-In Theater. Bird used to, quote, help out in the kitchen, you know? In flagrant violation of any number of health regulations. Scrambled eggs. Okay, sorry, more about this bird. This bird, pigeon, and the stone, if you get up close, and feel free to walk around afterwards or during, you can see that it's consecrated in memory of a pigeon named Koro Hato. Hato, I believe, is Japanese for dove or pigeon. Koro is an approximation of the Japanese onomatopoeia for what a pigeon sounds like. Koro, koro. I do know that Ed Sharp had that bird for 20 years, took care of it, treated it like family, used to fly I moved to Missoula in 1990, a year after Koro Hato supposedly died, but I definitely remember Ed Sharp, like with birds flying around, you know, birds hovering over the almond roca. That was the greatest thing. You know, you couldn't go get like Good and Plenty at the Chapel of the Dove, but you could get these amazing like little almond roca things imported from San Francisco in like their little paper wrapper. I mean, it was always just an extraordinary experience to see a movie there. And of course, birds flying around all over the place. I remember a really eccentric character. You know, of course, all of his clothes were stained on like one little shoulder because like this bird was pooping on him all the time. Scrambled eggs was the bird, Koro Hato's favorite meal. I think that the bird finally asphyxiated at the ripe old age, I imagine, for a bird of 20 on a snowy night coming back to Missoula from Wallace, Idaho. I think that they were moving around and he just didn't survive the car trip. Bird flu or something.
Every page of this apartment after he died.
Ed Sharp's?
And he used to leave the windows open and the pigeons would come and go and they had a roost up underneath.
There was a full dovecote on top of the Wilma. I think he maybe had 300 to 500 up there.
It was significant.
It was amazing pictures. I think that the pigeons were always a source of... I know that he got into trouble with some of his neighbors because they didn't really like 500 pigeons swarming around their parking lot. There was a lot of trouble with neighbors. But he loved them, and this bird, Koro Hato, I guess was pretty sharp by pigeon standards. Could like, you know, could work with money, could handle with money, could make change, you know. I think that Ed could hand him a bill and like the bird would literally go and fly across the drive-in theater or the concession stand and get change from somebody working at another cash register. They say that the bird could tell and was attracted to high denomination bills. You know, given the choice between a 1, a 5, and a 20, the bird would go for the 20 every time. Pretty sharp bird. Any questions so far about these characters? A swimming pool? Swimming pool didn't stick around for very long because it turns out having a swimming pool in your basement is pretty tough on your building. You know, they're humid, they're moist, a lot of chemicals involved. But then again, man, you know how, can you imagine what that was like? Ground floor swimming, lifeguards. You can still see some of these old brass fixtures. You can still see pieces of like the lifeguard stand in these office buildings. At least last time I stuck my head in, which was probably 3 years ago, you could still see some of the brass fittings that once upon a time would have been around the pool. Snack bar. I mean, really, you know how good French fries taste after you've been swimming? How good they smell after you've been swimming? Oh, what a great time that must have been. Crystal plunge. Any questions, comments about the place? You gotta forgive me, I sort of forget where I've been with this group. See what else I forgot. More about the Wilma sisters, I guess. Edith Wilma died in 1932. Later in life, much later in life, like her sister, she married a ventriloquist, another former vaudeville performer. And his claim to fame, I would give my eye teeth for a recording of this, but his claim to fame, her husband, and I didn't bring a picture of him, I'm sorry, but his name was Ketch, and his vaudeville act was that he could sing and harmonize with himself in 3 voices simultaneously. I cannot tell you how much time I've spent sitting around trying to imagine what that would sound like and how you would do that. And just, how do you do that? How do you sing 3 things at the same time? I've seen movies about these, Mongolian throat singers and Tibetan monks who have learned how to free up certain resonating chambers and, kind of making more of their sound apparatus than most of us do. I don't know if you guys have heard any throat singing. I think the answer is halfway there, but I just can't imagine how you could do all of those little errands at the same time. Sing and harmonize with yourself. I love it. If you ever find a catch record, let me know. I will pay top dollar. We got any questions about this place? About the current state of the Wilma, I can't say much. I think it's been sold again recently, over the summer. My understanding is that there's not as much focus on movies at the Wilma anymore. More of a live venue. But that's just something you kind of hear on the playground. I don't really know the whole story there. I do know that the Wilma has a fantastic shaggy dog history, and some of the things that supposedly happened there just stagger belief. But in the meantime, that's about all I got. Thanks. Feel free to come and have a look. All these things are back here.